then we do something unheralded in a Liberal Democrat fringe meeting and start early. And a few more people might come in. And obviously Liberal Democrats get the award for being the most polite and punctual, band of political activists and operatives across the land.
Yeah,
quite right. I'm Neil from Compass. I am a member of the Labour Party. Don't start. But I always, and I say this every time, I always love coming to Liberal Democrat Conference because I feel at home. I feel at home politically. I feel at home culturally. I feel like I'm with, the people the same kind of people that I love in the Labour Party. And I don't love all the people in the Labour Party. But when I'm with Liberal Democrats, because I always kind of beg the question, am I a social liberal or am I a liberal socialist? And I don't know what the answer is, right? Because I think they're pretty much the same kind of thing, right? And I guess that's what we're here to talk about over the next hour before we go back to listen to the question and answer session in the conference with Ed. So we'll finish dead on time so people can do that. And Compass has done lots of fringe meetings at Liberal Democrat conferences, and you can read the 20-year history of Compass in here. I tell you about our journey from being a solely Labour Party organisation to opening up in 2011 and embracing and wanting and welcoming in Liberal Democrats and Greens and people of all party and none who want a good society, which is much more equal, democratic and sustainable. And we've become a much richer, better organisation by having Liberal Democrats in our ranks and having the things that Liberal Democrats hold dear, a belief in Europe, a belief in democracy, a belief in civil liberties, a belief in care, a belief in protecting the environment. And I'm not sure sometimes why I'm not a member of the Liberal Democrat Party, but all of those things. But just to say, right, it's really important that we have people who are social liberals, in the Labour Party. That's really important to try and bend the Labour Party to a politics of social liberalism or liberal socialism. But just to say, and this is the serious point, of all the years I've been coming to Liberal Democrat conferences, I don't feel there's ever been a time where the need for social liberalism has been so important against the politics of authoritarian populism. I've never felt that fear so much as you see what potentially could just happen still in America, about what's just happened in those two regions in Germany. And of course, what happened in our own country at the last election, where Reform got 14% of the vote. And at some stages, you think, thank God for first past the post. But you don't really. You don't really, because, there are a bunch of anti-democrats who will play fast and loose with every electoral reform system to get what they want. And in the Sunday Times last week, the chair of Reform UK was saying, look, we got 14% this time. Next time, we could win a majority on 32%. And it's PR that's holding back the spread of the far right in Europe, where they would have majorities in the Netherlands and other places if it wasn't for PR. And I think that's one of the most important, cross-party campaigns we've got to push for. And it's really great to see Sarah and Keith and people from Liberal Democrats for PR here. And it's really important that your party keeps pushing for that. I understand the frustration of the Labour Party, but look, this thing, if we keep pushing from within Parliament, outside of Parliament, in civil society, in the business community, if we keep pushing and pushing, then there will be an opportunity for us to win proportional representation for our country and have a politics which is fair and equal and enables us to do the things that we want to do in terms of our social liberalism, and to check the spread of the far right, because they can't win a majority on 32%, even if they get anywhere near it. So we keep having to push for that. But look, we've got an exciting panel, well, I'll introduce briefly in a minute, but we've got an exciting agenda in terms of the next 4 years. Let's try and work out where we can get cross-party cooperation going, where it's going to be really needed, all the big things. And you'll also find on your chair the latest publication from Compass called The New Settlement. If we want anything in there that's deep, transformative, meaningful, that is going to change our country and fend off the threat of the far right, then you're going to have to be things that are embedded. No single party No single government is going to change our society for good for long enough in the way that we need. It's going to work. It's going to need people on the progressive side of politics working together. So hopefully we can explore the issues in which we can work together over the next 4 or 5 years between the excellent panelists, from local government up through to health, through to Vince's experience, and through to what Roz is going to be working on, as a new member of Parliament, on the issues that she's going to be campaigning on and working on. But I'll just finish by saying this. To me, it isn't just the policy agenda that we have to change, and we have to get that right. All the economic stuff, all the welfare stuff, the care stuff, etc. We have to get the policy right. But actually, in the end, it's the culture of our politics that we have to change. Now, I watch my party and, Keir Starmer saying he's going to roll up his sleeves and he's going to deliver this and deliver that. And I look at the world and I think just how volatile and complex and changing and fast moving our world is. The idea that any small group of people are going to run our country more effectively just through technocracy, just from top-down politics, just through a politics of delivery, it isn't going to happen. We have to change the culture of our politics to let everyone into it, not just, be nice to even allow people like me to be part of it in the Labour Party, but like people from other parties, people in civil society, people in the business world, in the social business world. There are so many rich answers out there. We need a politics which is open and plural and agile and flexible and building on all the great work, creativity and thinking in the public services, in civil society, in business. It's a new politics we're going to need. And the Liberal Democrats, I think, are at the forefront of believing and trusting in people. I like the state to do some things, but I trust people much more than I trust the state. That's why I'm a social liberal or a liberal socialist, right? And it's that new politics we've got to push for, because if we don't push for that, if we don't disperse power, if we don't open things up, if we don't form alliances and ecosystems and networks and build trust and relationships across our country, then the threat of whatever we try and do, the delivery stuff won't work by just pulling those old status levers. So it's that new politics we've got to think about and talk about, not just the policy agenda. Anyway, to do that, we've got a fantastic panel. And we're going to start with Vince Cable, who doesn't need any introduction whatsoever. And then I think we're going to go over to Layla, who doesn't need any introduction whatsoever. And we're excited to hear about what she's going to say in terms of, no, you don't need an introduction either, in terms of chairing the Health Select Committee. And then Lucy Nethsingha, who's the Liberal Democrat leader on Cambridge County Council. We're going to hear about cooperation on Cambridge County Council. And then finally, Roz Savage, who's the new MP for Cotswold South. You're going to talk about what she's doing. That's brilliant. Absolutely fantastic. Big round of applause. Really, quite against the odds, wasn't it? Getting there, getting selected and winning, it's just amazing. And now, if anyone can dig themselves in there and stay there and do a great job, it'll be Roz. Anyway, so great panel. We'll have about 5 to 7 minutes of each of the panelists, and there'll be plenty of time for questions from you before we disappear at 2 o'clock. All right, so thank you for being here. And Vince, over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, thanks to Campus for organising the meeting. It's obviously very popular. And I just want to thank them for what they've been doing over the years, because actually this work, in a kind of subliminal kind of way, has made it easier for tactical voting, frankly. There's an absolutely critical part of both Labour's result and ours at last election. And Campus sort of made it respectable. What I'd like to start with, just responding to Neil's challenge, that we shouldn't back off proportional representation simply because we let gain the system. I hear a bit of whispering sometimes, maybe we should, play down the issue now we've got on top of all this. But it would be deeply cynical and would be seen as deeply cynical. It's probably not in our long-term interest to back off either. And we shouldn't be frightened of the fact that if we got a fairer voting system, there would be more people from the populist right. One of the main lessons from European politics is that trying to create firewalls and keeping out people who are legitimate, if unpleasant, is not a sustainable option. So, your long-term campaigning for proportional voting, political reform, is as valid as ever, and we should be at the heart of all that. But the question that you asked, that will certainly me to address, was this whole issue about moving away from process to policy. Are there sensible things that you can talk about with other parties to try to get a consensus? Because there are many things in national life which extend far beyond the life of a parliament, and they're not going to work unless you get buy-in across the party political boundaries. And I suppose I'm here as a sort of old fogey who's sort of been through quite a few of these exercises and just highlight a few cases where, cross-party working has delivered or not delivered long-term thinking and policy. There are one or two successes, and we tend not to think about them very much. But unlike, say, France, Britain has been very good at long-term pensions thinking. It's survived decades. it's politically it's complicated, annuities and actuarial discount rates. Most people switch off, but that has been a process of building on what originally started with the old Liberal Party, that good state pension. Building on the system. Steve Webb's work in the coalition, stakeholders, and so on, which has been sustained. That is one of the really big success stories. There are others. Gordon Brown's independence for the Bank of England is another one, which the Tories don't get rid of. I made my maiden speech on this in Parliament almost 30 years ago, and it's survived. It's a very important institution. In the budget, in a few weeks' time, actually, probably some of the most important decisions will be around very complicated issues to do with the balance sheet of the Bank of England and how that plays into the budget. But the fact that this has become a kind of political consensus arrived at in a way that is not the case in the United States is very important for this country and the maturity of our political dialogue. A more controversial case is climate policy. There's some fractiousness come in with Sunak's silly backtracking in the last couple of years. But by and large, climate policy has been pretty consensual, cross-party stuff. It may be uncomfortable to remember this, but the first politician who made it an issue was actually Margaret Thatcher. And it stayed with us. And it's going to be very important that we sustain that because there's, in the autumn budget, almost certainly fuel duty is going to go up. There will be a temptation for people to do populism around all this. The conversion from petrol vehicles to renewable energy at the end of the decade, what kind of timetable? If business companies are going to adjust to that, they need clarity, they need certainty that rolls beyond the Parliament. So that we've got to have a consensus around climate policy and as much buy-in as possible. And by and large, the UK has been pretty good at that. One even more controversial example, of course, is Europe. We know the horrors that have happened, but for 40 years, there was a sort of cross-party consensus on Europe, and it held, and we've got to rebuild it. But just in the few minutes I've got, I'll just sort of highlight a couple of issues I think we do need to think about with other parties, and I included One Nation Tories as well as the Labour Party. One of the obvious ones is social care. And Ed Davey's done a fantastic job in putting this on the national agenda. But there are two awkwardnesses about it. One is money. Governments will say, yeah, let's spend more money on carers, but they're not doing anything because you have to fund it. The other is more ideological, and it's sort of lurking beneath the surface, but I'm very conscious because I was in the cabinet when we talked about Dilnot and so on about a decade ago, that the core of the disagreement around social care is what you do about the maximum charge and whether you put a cap on it. And a lot of the energy behind the campaigns come from middle-class owner-occupiers who have to give up their family house, so there isn't an inheritance. And certainly people on the left regard inheritance subsidies as not good policy, which is actually why this government has quietly buried social care, because they wouldn't accept that principle of, defending inheritance, which is the source of a lot of the angst around the subject. But it's got to be solved. And the problem is out there, the population getting older, you can have more and more difficulties in dealing with people with dementia. Person on my right is going to have to produce the answers to this in the next. There is a difficult issue of not just about money, but about ideology, and it's an issue we need to resolve essentially with the Labour Party. The other one, and I'll finish on this, just to make your meeting even more uncomfortable, the horror that I was handed on my first day on being Secretary of State was universities. And I discovered, I realized I was going to do as Secretary in the coalition, was that I was responsible for universities, and that the universities were going bust. Large numbers of departments faced closure, staff laid off, cut student numbers, cut bursaries, blah, 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 blah. What are you going to do about it? Well, I was then told by my civil servant, Minister, you don't need to worry because there's already a cross-party consensus on this issue, isn't it? Your Labour predecessor and your Tory colleague, Mr. Willett, agreed on what we should do about student tuition fees. We appointed Lord Brown to produce a report. And of course, fees will be set at the market rate, which can go up to 18,000. I said, well, actually, Lib Dems never signed up to this. And so, well, we had a horrible mess, as you all remember. We finished up with something that was regarded as good policy, but appalling politics. And the party still hurts to this day over this issue. But this problem, exactly the problem I was faced with 15 years ago, is now back on the agenda. Well, universities are going bust. Overseas student income fees can't sustain it. There's no government money. Horrible, unpopular decisions are going to have to be made by the Labour government. So do we work with them? Do we denounce them from scratch, which is what we did before 2010 and landed ourselves in a lot of difficulty through populist politics? Or do we think about it? Do we try to get some sort of consensus on how you keep one of the world's best university systems functioning? So this is, there are real challenges out there. I mean, it's easy to have a slogan saying, let's have dialogue, let's chat to other parties. But the issues we're dealing with, and I've just highlighted two, are really, really difficult issues. And there's a fundamental question, do you work with other parties when they're difficult and you get some of the mess on your hands if you work with them? I think my own conclusion is that in a political culture which is fundamentally, when there's a loss of trust, when it's aggressively competitive and negative in the way our system is, it's actually very difficult to do. So actually, the proportional representation, in a way, comes before the dialogue. Because once you have a system which is more based on coalition as a normal form of government, you could then have sensible cross-party discussions. Having it in an environment that is still politically toxic and aggressive is very, very difficult. So I'm leaving you with a challenge rather than just but thank you for listening.
Yeah. How's it going to play out in health?
Well, right. 2 steps captain by the way. Oh, okay. And I can't see the back row. Okay, fine, no problem. So first of all, it's great to be here. I want to start by thanking Neil for introducing me to Roz, because I remember when we had a coffee with Neil, and I think it was PCH, and he was like, I know this great woman. She's amazing. I really want you to meet her. She's going to be a brilliant MP. And I agree with all of the above. So thank you to Compass. Yeah. But in all seriousness, Compass has been also very supportive of me over the 7 years that I've been elected. And I'm very, very grateful for the work that they do in trying to create that politics that gives a bit of space. Often what Compass is able to do is just bring people together who have like-minded ideas and put them in a room, give them a question, and we get to know each other. And those behind-the-scenes conversations that happen in Parliament are so incredibly valuable. I'll talk about the Select Committee in a moment, but in a sense, that's the structured bit of it. The bit that people often don't see are those behind the scenes conversations between people who just get on with each other across different parties. There's I think it's Times Radio that does the sort of political frenemies slot. I love that. You get to pick someone from another party and talk about why you like each other. It's really nice. But actually, there's more of that than you might ever imagine, because when you take away the sort of, cut and thrust of politics, actually, ultimately, we are all humans. Most of us are there. And I would argue, let's say all of us, for sake of let's find an exception, are there to make the world a better place. Now, we have strong arguments as to what that world might look like, how we might go about achieving it. But by and large, MPs, against what people think out there, are there to do their absolute best for their constituents and for the country. And almost all the MPs I've ever met, that is their driving force. The difference now for Liberal Democrats is not just our numbers, but it's two things. The third party status just gives us so many more opportunities to do things that we didn't have before. The obvious one that everyone will see are the two questions at Prime Minister's questions. And there is actually a whole argument about it should be three questions, actually, because if you do the proportions of questions to parties, because we've had the highest ever number of Lib Dem MPs, we should probably take one off Sunak. The Speaker had no time for that argument at all. But the point is, we have this grouping now that allows us to do this. And it's been a long time that we've had that third party status. What it means is, and this was just such a breath of fresh air, notwithstanding my Palestinian heritage, notwithstanding being foreign affairs spokesperson, every time there was a debate on Israel-Palestine, I found myself consigned to having to speak near the end of the debate for 2 or 3 minutes. The first time that we had a debate on this Parliament, I had unlimited time. So I spoke for 20 minutes. And it was amazing. It was amazing because you could flesh out your arguments. You could really work on, the getting people with you and having that influence across the House. And that's going to happen now with all the debates that we're part of, let alone, the committees that people don't see for legislation. But the other thing that's different is I've got the personal mobile phone numbers of most of the cabinet, because we used to be in opposition with Labour. When we were fighting the Tories, we got to know those members of the Labour Party who have now worked their way up over the last few years. And there are so much more conversation that could be had behind the scenes in order to try and get stuff done. So I think our influence is not going to be just about the number of MPs we've got. It's also about that change of government and the people that used to be with you in the lobbies against the old one. And, many of whom we'd call friends are now in cabinet. And yes, we're going to challenge them. And yes, we're going to push them to do better. But it's a completely different footing on which we start that relationship with the people who hold that executive power. And I think that's going to be incredibly important. Nowhere more important, I would argue, and this is just so blindingly obvious, is health. Just for a moment, though, I want you to consider, given the power that the Labour Party has, why did they let us have health and social care as a select committee? Just think about that, because we were shocked. We were genuinely shocked. I'd had a conversation with, Ed and Wendy, and, what is it that we want? And, we were obviously talking about sewage and NEFRA and energy and, science. We'd had that before. Norman Lamb very ably led the Science and Technology Select Committee in the Theresa May Parliament. And I remember saying a throwaway comment, but the dream is health and social care, surely. And I remember, looking over at Wendy, she's like, yeah, that's just never going to happen. And yet it did. Why? Because they, in a way, they know what we're going to be pushing on. We could not have been clearer over the election what our priority is, and social care and the NHS being top. And so the conclusion I came to is it wouldn't have been something that, West Streeting blocked, and that they want us to talk about it. And why would a government want us to talk about these thorny issues? Well, we all know that within government, there is, what the Prime Minister wants, then there's, what the cabinet members may want, which are often the same thing, but it's a question of priorities. And then it's got to get through the Treasury. And the more that you can speak about a topic, the more that you can make the case for something, the more likely it is that you might actually be able to get particularly things of the medium and longer term. The Treasury doesn't love that. It's the same conversations when you're having about infrastructure or anything else. Climate's another one. Actually making the case to the Treasury that spending something now saves you money in the medium and long term is a very difficult argument. You've got to make it very strongly, and you've got to have that cross-party consensus. So I see it as a positive. I see it as an invitation from the Labour Party to hold their feet to the fire over the things that we were campaigning on. I should also say, just very briefly, because it is true, I don't get to decide as chair. I get to suggest as chair what we look at, and then it's for the committee members to vote on it. And that's what I'd like, is a consensus-based committee where we would vote on our future programme. But I've been very clear with the clerks. I want us to start with social care, the biggest issue that our country faces. And the thing I want us to look at is, what is the cost of not acting? Because the conversation is always about what is the cost of doing it. And Andrew Dilmont, incidentally, is a constituent of mine. He's already given me a tutorial on this. I could not have had a better start to understanding the issues and the politics. But frankly, we know broadly what the issues are and what the answers are. What we don't have is that consensus, and what we need is a new push. So what I'm intent that we start looking at is, how do we make the arguments for what happens if you don't act? And the consequences there are to the Treasury, but it's also to local government. There's a huge impact on local government, huge impact on the rest of society. And it's not very well quantified, is what Andrew Dilmont told me. So I think there's an obvious place for the committee to start pushing on this issue, among many others.
Very much. I think you set you up very well there, Lucy, to have some comments on what's going on in local government, where the practice can be slightly less adversarial and there's some more opportunities for cross-party cooperation. So what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. I'm very tempted to just carry on the conversation where Layla left it, and certainly social care is the critical issue for upper tier local authorities, which is what I lead. I lead Cambridgeshire County Council, where I am the leader of the largest group, which is the Liberal Democrats. But we are only able to lead the council with the support of our Labour and independent colleagues. So we've been in this joint administration arrangement since 2021, so 3.5 years. When we started that process, that term of office, the three groups who I lead had a majority over the Conservatives of 5. So it was pretty tight, and we needed everybody to be on board all of the time. Over the course of the last 3.5 years, delightfully, the Conservatives have lost quite a few members and we have gained some. So rather than the Conservatives now being the largest party on the council, the Liberal Democrats are now the largest party on the council. But it's still fairly tight, and the relationships between us and our Labour and independent colleagues are really crucial. Those have had rocky times over those 3.5 years. I mean, it's not been an easy 3.5 years for local government. I don't think you'll find anybody who thinks that the last 3.5 years have been a time of joy and tranquility for the local government sector. We have had really difficult financial decisions to make, and we've got another really difficult budget round coming up this autumn. We are facing a £40 million gap between the budget that we had set last year, expecting to meet this year, and what we're now expecting it to be. A huge amount of that is rising costs in children's social care, in children's special educational needs, and home to school transport. They are all really closely related. I mean, the completely broken system in special needs education, children's mental health, children's social care, they are completely interrelated, and they're also closely connected to our school system, which the previous government never seemed to recognise that the school system had anything to do with children's mental health. Interesting. So those are some of the things that we've been kind of trying to deal with. Then they're not easy things to deal with, but they wouldn't be easy things to deal with if I was leading an entirely Liberal Democrat council either. And one of the things that it's important to kind of be aware of is that actually leading council is quite hard work and complicated, and there are always different priorities, and people within groups have different opinions, just as people from different political parties have different opinions. And leading a coalition, sometimes at least you have some structures about how you deal with those. and those are very important. They have been very important kind of during our coalition, and the structures that we set up at the beginning and the framework that we set out at the beginning about how we were going to work together and what our joint priorities were have been critical. But even more important are the personal relationships. So, I mean, there were around this time last year, I mean, actually at Liberal Democrat Conference last year, there was a really, really toxic debate blowing up in Cambridgeshire around the proposal for road charging in Cambridge. My goodness, it was difficult. My Labour deputy had been leading the consultation on that. She was deeply committed to it. But people on both within Labour and within in the Liberal Democrats were saying that is electorally toxic. It is kind of you can't do it. You don't have the support of the population. So there was this incredibly difficult debate, and it's one that actually, I mean, that's a kind of microcosm of the difficulty of doing something that you think might be right for the future, for your area, and whether it's electorally possible, whether it's electorally manageable. And actually, some of the conversations that we have about populism are also about that, and about climate change and about university tuition fees, are about how you manage that conflict between what you can do, what you think maybe is part of a solution to a big problem that needs solving, and what people will accept. And clearly there are kind of part of politics is about dealing with those decisions and making those difficult calls. We had a really difficult one to make last autumn. It was really difficult. And I was very worried that my relationship with my delightful Labour deputy would never recover. Fortunately, it has. But my goodness, those relationships are important. And if we had had a less strong relationship at the start, I don't think it would have recovered. I cannot thank her enough for being kind enough to kind of get over that whole debate. It was really difficult. But I'm now watching the new Labour government going into making many of the same really difficult decisions about what's right for the long term and the future versus the political now. And it's not any easier even when you've got a massive majority in Parliament. Those things are always really hard, but that's what politics is about. In local government, we are waiting to see what kinds of decisions Rachel Reeves is going to make in her autumn statement. Just looking back at last year's autumn statement, part of that was an announcement of a big uplift to the national living wage, which in some ways was wonderful. If you were in local government, that was a massive, huge new problem on your budget. So we've been dealing with that. That's part of our current budget gap. There was no new money for it. We are waiting to see whether Rachel Reeves will raise the council tax cap or indeed remove it completely, which would pass a whole lot of her problems over to be our problems, and leave us with more of those difficult decisions about what's politically acceptable versus what do we do for the most vulnerable. It's not easy. One of the things we were asked about was looking forward to 2025, where are the Liberal Democrats in local government? What do we think is likely to happen? We've got county council elections coming up in May 2025. I think they're going to be really exciting. Just looking across the east of England, it is not at all impossible that the Conservatives could lose control of pretty much all of those councils. So that's Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Hertfordshire, following Cambridgeshire into not being in Conservative control. I mean, how that happens, we'll see. And it may not happen. And I think there are some of those I've been much more confident about than others. But if you look at the electoral map and what happened in the most recent election, actually, the vote share has fractured all over the place, and the likelihood of a lot of councils moving to no overall control and a lot of upper tier councils, because those are the next set of elections, moving to no overall control is quite high. And it will be interesting to see what happens with the reform vote. But actually, the Green vote's up, the Labour vote's up, the Liberal Democrats vote's up in lots of different places. That might be quite interesting for those elections, and there might be other people dealing with my problems. in a year's time.
Well, I hope there's a lot of Liberal Democrats dealing with your problems, Lucy. Thank you so much. Roz, you've been in there a few months. How is it? And how are you going to deal with cross-party cooperation?
Thanks, Neil. And I want to thank you not just for inviting me to speak on this very distinguished panel, but also you were one of the first political people that I met after I embarked on this political journey less than 2 years ago. This coming Wednesday will be the second anniversary of me deciding to stand for Parliament. It has been crazy fast. And I remember hearing you speaking on my friend Amanda Scott's podcast called Accidental Gods, and you just absolutely blew my socks off with your case for a progressive alliance for proportional representation. And you continue to blow my socks off. So thank you very much for that. And thank you also for introducing me to Layla, who's been a wonderful guide and mentor on this short but very rapid journey that I've been on. So I'd like to talk about working with Labour sort of in three concentric circles, starting with one that's very personal to me and sort of working outwards from there. So about 10 days ago, I was just starting to feel that I might be somewhat getting the hang of this MPing thing when we had the private members bill ballot. And I came third. I can't take any credit for this. It's basically a tombola that means that you get to present a law or a bill. And I'm suddenly everybody's new best friend. My inbox has been absolutely rammed. My team has not appreciated this. But of course, as a Lib Dem, if I want to present a bill that is going to have any chance at all of success, then I need to know that Labour are going to support it. There is a way where Labour sort of hand out the bills that they want to see passed, but they don't want to do. And you could just take one of those. But, I didn't come into politics as an idea-free zone. I do have a few thoughts of my own as to what I would like to do. I haven't seen the handouts yet, so maybe I should keep an open mind on that. But no matter what issue I choose, and that was not an invitation, by the way, for all of you to pitch me as well. No matter what issue I choose, I'm seeing this as an absolutely brilliant learning opportunity as to how I can reach out to the other parties in Westminster and enlist support. And I'm sure that by the end of this process, sometime next year, I will know an awful lot more people and a lot more about the lawmaking process than I do at the moment. Then the medium circle. Clearly, Labour have got a pretty useful number of MPs at the moment, and so they can do anything in effect that they want. But I think there is a real opportunity there for us to get some of our really fabulous policies, and especially with the work of our extremely capable select committee chairs. It would be wonderful if we can use the camaraderie of this cross-the-aisle collaboration to get some of our liberal democratic policies actually onto the agenda. And I know I've heard different views expressed about this. Somebody said, well, it's not our job to create solutions to problems as the Lib Dems, because then Labour will take the credit for it. However, I don't know if this is just a sign of my political naivety. I'm not particularly tribal, and I tend to take quite a utilitarian view. How can we achieve the greatest good to the greatest number over the longest period of time? So I'm not really into politics or politicking, but I am into policy, and I hope that we can get some of our really fabulous policies enacted. And then the largest circle. I'm hearing from particularly farmers at the moment in my rural constituency of the South Cotswolds, but also from teachers, from healthcare professionals, from business people, that they need to know what the long-term direction of travel is. When you think about farmers, for example,
the equipment that they need to buy, the decisions that they need to make about what to plant and where, they have to plan for the long term. They need a strategy that is going to transcend changes in government. And so I think we really owe it to them to work across party to come up with those long-term strategies so that they can plan accordingly. They can't expect to turn on a sixpence every time there's a change of government. And finally, I just want to pick up on something that Neil mentioned about the issue of trust. Like I'm sure many of you, I've knocked on a great many doors this year in that lovely soaking wet spring that we had. And you've probably been on the receiving end of some fairly frank views about what people think of politics and politicians. There is a crisis of confidence in our political system. And I think if we're going to restore that trust and really the relationship between the electorate and the elected, then we do need some pretty fundamental changes. And I think that PR could be one of those changes. I will say I struggle to see how it could possibly happen. Of course, we hoped that Labour might not get an outright majority and they might need us and we might be able to be in a stronger bargaining position. Now that they have done so well under first past the post, it's hard to see how the stars might align. It always seems to be the case that the party that has the power to make this sort of constitutional change doesn't have the incentive because the existing system is serving them very well. Thank you very much. It's the system that gave them the power. And the people that have the incentive don't have the power. So it's hard to see how we might navigate to PR, but I do think it would be an absolute game changer to have a combination of PR and also decentralisation of decision making down to the community level, because the experts on a community are the people who live in it. And so many people just feel like government is done to them, not for them, let alone with them. And I'm starting to see really promising signs of this happening. I'm trying to find the silver lining here in the 14 years of austerity. And even now we're being told that government has got no money, so hence local councils have no money. And what I'm starting to see is communities saying if there is no money anywhere, then how can we look to our neighbours? How can we share resources? How can we come together and meet our local needs just within this circle? And so I feel tremendously encouraged by that. And this is also one of the benefits of my rather unusual constituency that straddles a county line. It's half in Gloucestershire and half in Wiltshire, that we're already cross-pollinating, adopting and adapting ideas from one side of the county line to the other. So I think the future is exciting. I'd be interested to get Layla and Vince's sense of this, but I do feel like there is a shift happening in Westminster. I hope that's not just wishful thinking on my part. And I do remain hopeful, stubbornly optimistic about what might be possible in the future. Thank you all very much.
Thanks so much, Roz. Right, we've got about 20 minutes, so let's get as many questions in as possible. I think Layla's got a microphone somewhere. She has indeed. There's a woman at the front here. Let's start there. We'll do some of this side, then we'll come over to that side.
Yeah, here you go.
We'll get 3 questions in, and then the panel can pick which bits they want to answer. We won't answer every bit.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Tam Langley. So I run a coalition of baby charities, and we're interested in prevention, which Layla's just said it's very hard to make the economic case for. I just wondered, social care has been mentioned a lot on the panel, and social care for children seems to be bankrupting local authorities, along with social care for older people. Do you think that an area of potential cross-party interest could be actually talking about something that both Liberal Democrats and Labour traditionally have found really difficult to talk about, which is how do we support families to look after their relatives better than we do at the moment? Because something that the last government did was talk about families, but it's one of those political areas that's very uncomfortable for both Labour and Lib Dems, who tend to always look to public services. So it's not an either or. Public services need more investment as well. But in the current context, do you think we need to be talking about how we support families or communities to look after the very young vulnerable and the very older vulnerable people in our society.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Let's try and keep the questions short as possible. I don't know. Hang on a minute. Can Sarah or Keith say something about PR and the campaign around PRs? Well, just to make or ask a question, or just to make a quick point, Keith, because that was brought up and it's important.
Yeah,
what's going to happen?
Well, I'm chair of the Liberal Democrats for Electoral Reform. Sarah is also on the executive. Very encouraged to hear what everybody has said. Certainly agree with Vince that this is no time to back off it just because we did quite well, and what about reform? And what we do believe is that we now have the opportunity and the need as a party to push for electoral reform. A, it would benefit us in the long term, but the most fundamental point is that the disillusion and the alienation is fragmenting the very strength of our democracy and our society. And who knows where it's going to go if this government fails. So we see an opportunity. We're talking to our campaigns teams about how to get campaigning content into the local party to support. So as well as what's being done in Westminster, we see ourselves an opportunity now to really take it out into the country and campaign very forcefully for that.
Thanks, Glenn. Thank you for all the work you're doing. There's a guy at the back, thank you. And then we'll come back to the panel, then we'll do this side. And we've got Unlock in the room, Unlock Democracy, which are great. I'm sure some ERS are here. All the PR campaigns and our campaigners are working together much more effectively, and long may that last. Thank you, sir.
Now, the word collaboration has been used many times in a lot of topic, but could you say where that collaboration begins and ends? When personally viewing it, is it's great that the election was held and we get together within cards nationally, but your thoughts or the panel's thoughts that collaboration should actually begin before the elections, where we divvy up the seats.
Okay, Paul, do you want to say something?
Well, I actually know Ken is actually one of my councillors.
Well, yeah. Well, let's get this out on the table, and then we'll come back to the panel. Paul, why don't you say a quick word? Say who you are, and
So my name is Paul Follows. I'm the leader of Waverley Borough Council. I've run a coalition since 2019 that got re-elected with a slightly larger Liberal Democrat majority in 23. I had lost in Godalming and Ash to the now former Chancellor of the Exchequer by 891 votes. In doing so, my Green cabinet member for environment was thrown out of his own party, which has made our internal management slightly more complicated at Waverley. What we did in 2023 was use our coalition to actually write effectively a joint manifesto. I think the question that one of my colleagues, Councillor Ken Reid from Cranley in Waverley, has brought up is really about going about selection of seats. So, for example, in my area, we had a Tory supermajority. Absolutely, 51 of 57 seats were blue. And by some level of working together and effectively, efficiently applying our resources across that patch, we were able to break that domination and then expand our hold in 23 on the same principles. But it does cause consternation in local parties when you're talking about stand-asides. So I too would be very keen to hear the thoughts of the room and the panel, particularly on that subject. But I would also just encourage the trying to bring together some kind of thoughts and ideas prior to standing if you've got parties and people you agree with, because a lot of this is about people you can work with and know. I would consider the now former Green Steve Williams, who's a Compass member as well, to be one of my closest political colleagues, irrelevant to the fact that he's a Green. And equally, the Labour leader at Waverley is somebody who I can't do the job without. Same with the independent leader. So it is about the people as much as it is about the parties and maintaining those relationships. But for me, I found it easier, effectively coming together, figuring out what ideas we all actually share, and then running on those at the same time to be beneficial. But this issue of stand-asides and seats has always been a bit Marmite for people. So very keen to hear views.
Thank you. And I think, we call that a progressive tragedy, and it really is a tragedy that Paul isn't the member of Parliament for his seat and representing that seat. And the Greens got more votes than he lost by. And that's the rottenness of our bloody electoral system. Should we go this way down the panel? Roz, do you want to, don't answer every question.
Yes.
I'll answer a couple as quickly as you can. Then we can get more questions in.
Okay. Stand-asides. And Paul, I'm really sorry for your loss, so to speak. Yes, next time. Yes, I also used to live in a tragedy seat in Stroud. Yeah, it hurts. Yeah. I wonder whether stand-asides are necessary, because I think clearly there have been a few tragedy seats, but this time around it did seem that in the majority of seats it was fairly clear who the viable alternative to a Conservative was going to be. Labour's list of non-battleground seats was quite a valuable tool in our campaign arsenal, although it seemed the local Labour team had not got the memo on that one. Yeah, so it's actually a question that I want to ask back to the room is whether stand-asides are necessary. I was interested for the South Devon primary that did identify our amazing candidate, Caroline Voden. Delighted to see her elected. But I wonder how widespread or how valuable that would actually be. I don't think, my sense is that it's not necessary in the majority of seats.
Okay, good. Lucy, anything you want to pick up on from those questions?
I might pick them all up really quickly.
Quickly, as long as it's quickly.
So on the children's and social care one, yes, it's really important to give families the support that they need in order to keep looking after family members. My goodness, the state benefits so much from that. We should give them far more support. It is something that was in the Lib Dem manifesto. So, and Ed has personal experience about it, and he feels really strongly. Electoral reform. I just want to say that this is not just about Westminster. The next set of elections that are coming up are the mayoral elections, where we had not brilliant PR, but we did have central preferences. The fact that the Conservatives removed that meant that actually we lost at least one really good Lib Dem mayor in Bedford. And there is a danger that in Cambridgeshire, where we have a Labour mayor who was elected on Lib Dem second preferences, we may end up with a Conservative again. So if you can put pressure on Labour to change that, please do, because they can now. They could just do it. It would just be going back, or they could make it better. You could also look at much more PR in local government. And please, can we talk about Lords reform? It's not just about Westminster. And all of those are really good ways of improving the representation in government in this country. It's not everything is about the House of Commons. Sorry, small rant. On divvying up seats, I actually really loathe that term because it doesn't give the respect to the electorate that they ought to have. And particularly from a Liberal Democrat perspective, you have to remember that quite a lot of our voters will alternatively vote Conservative. I mean, there probably aren't all that many people in this room who are Lib Dem voters who, if the choice was made, would vote Conservative rather than Labour. But if you go out and look at the people who actually vote for us, not necessarily our activists, they're not necessarily quite the same. And that's true for all political parties. A number of our voters, given the choice between Labour and Conservative only, or Green and Conservative, would vote Conservative. So actually having Liberal Democrats standing isn't always unhelpful to a progressive cause, and divvying up seats doesn't give people that sense of choice. The point that was made by, I can't remember your name, and I'm really sorry, Paul, about alignment on policy is really, really important, because actually where there is a strong consensus among progressive parties on policy, not only are we able to deliver it in places where we're in coalition comfortably with agreement with everybody, it also raises the ability to talk about those policies and push them in the national press in all sorts of places. You can build, if you can build consensus between progressive parties, you can build it with the public too.
Brilliant.
Yeah, what a lot of this comes back to is local government and local government finance, and the fact that most councils are now bust. And if there's anything that needs cross-party consensus, it's about local government finance. And there are easy things to do. You know, the government can get rid of this referendum requirements on council tax, which was a nasty wheeze by Pickles in the coalition to cripple Labour councils in the north of England. The second easiest thing to do, which the government will probably do, is to reband and build in a more progressive system with higher value properties paying more, but that's not going to go down well, I'm afraid, in some of the seats we now represent. The third bit, which is the most important, which is revaluation. And, you know, this is an absolutely toxic issue. Nobody will touch it. The Tories wouldn't touch it. The coalition wouldn't touch it. Labour won't touch it. But we've now got valuations based on house prices 35 years ago.
Yeah.
Completely insane. But any government knows that if several million people are having to pay more, they risk losing their vote. So nobody will touch it. And if we can actually get an agreement between the major parties to do it, and ideally move over to something, linked to land rather than property. But even with property, it has to be done. This is absolutely fundamental to all these arguments we're having about local council. Yeah.
Thanks. So, I think families does have that kind of, families, what type of family? It feels very, that's the Tory bit. Communities, however, allowing families to look differently than perhaps, in our old-fashioned storybooks. That I think Liberal Democrats easily get behind. And certainly in Oxfordshire, we led the charge on reopening children's centres for exactly that reason. Not just because it helps families, it helps whole communities and it becomes a hub for everybody who needs it. So totally with that. On electoral reform, I actually completely agree about it's not just about Westminster. The depressing thing is I don't think Labour are going to touch this. I mean, I really just don't think it's going to touch, because they are also the beneficiaries very often from the mayoral election too. The one area, though, it's broader reform of the system is votes at 16. I do think that is an area where they've been fairly emphatic. My understanding is they've been asked about that quite recently and were warm towards it, at least in the rhetoric. I'll be curious to see at what point, if they decide to actually go there. And, ideally we get there first and remind them that it was our policy to begin with. And the reason why you need something like that, something quite totemic, is to show people, who are naturally small c conservative with systems, that you can change elements of the system and the world doesn't collapse, that you can be radical. And I would argue that votes at 16 is a quite radical policy that I do think might have a chance of getting through in this parliament. The whole collaboration, particularly at local government level, I mean, Oxfordshire is built on this. We are often held up as a very good example of where this has worked. And it has. I should say, as an aside, working with Labour has been really, really difficult. They are really tribal, very difficult to work with, often fighting like rats in a sack against each other. Very different flavour of Labour Party in Oxford City compared to the Labour Party in the towns and villages that surround in wider Oxfordshire. They often don't agree with each other, and that makes them just so difficult to work with. So it's kind of, we've had to work around Labour and we just don't really include them in things. However, we do have a very good working relationship with the Greens locally. And when we've been through this process, this has been a very long process, a 10-year process of getting to the point where there are now no longer any Tory MPs in Oxfordshire. All of our councils are run by either Labour or Liberal Democrat leaders, some outright, some in coalition. We've got the interesting situation in South Oxfordshire District Council that because they were in cabinet together, created a joint manifesto, and we won most of the seats. We didn't need to be in coalition anymore, yet they still sit on cabinet because it's in recognition of the fact that, we got to this position together. And the party doesn't love it, but it was the leader of that council thought it was the honourable thing to do, and it kind of works well. And on the Vale, we are one of the few councils, I think there's one or two others, who have no Tory or Labour councillors on it at all. And the only thing stopping it from being a one-party state is the fact that we did do a deal with a couple of Greens. And so they are essentially the official opposition. And it's nice to have them there. But essentially, we just completely run the show. So we are now definitely at the point, I mean, it sounds great, but actually, I don't think it's terribly... We've got to, at some point, have an exit strategy from this. This was always a means to an end. It was always about how do we kick the Tories out? And we've broadly done that. So at some point, now that we've done that, we are different parties for a reason. It is right to give the electorate choice. How do we both, all of us, put our best feet forward, give the electorate maximum choice, but not let the Tories back in? And so we now need a bit of an exit strategy from this. And it's going to be different for our different Oxfordshire councils, depending on what stage of the process we're at. So for the county councils next year, we still haven't completed the electoral cycle, and we are still very much in a minority coalition, which we hope to now get completely over the top so we don't have the threat of the Tories anymore. So for that one, it's going to be a different flavour altogether. than on the Vale and South Oxfordshire District Council, where it's now just getting a bit embarrassing. So it's going to have to be horses for courses. But for us, we have taken it one step at a time. It's brought us enormous success. We appreciate that success. We've done great things for our residents. We don't want to let the Tories back in, but we do need to now have that conversation about how do we release ourselves from this collaboration. It's worked well, but at some point it is going to have to stop. And it is a conversation that we are actively having.
Right. I think has anyone got a big, I did say, very, if there are quick questions, couple here, just really quick, and then we'll fly back and then we'll finish. Go on, quick.
So in Havant, which is next to Portsmouth, we had no Lib Dem councillors 2 years ago, and we started working on Progressive Alliance. Last year, 2 elected. This year, 7,
nice.
Including me.
Yeah, well done.
And we had 30, we had all ups. We had 30 Tories. We now have 13. Biggest loss in the country, I believe. And probably the only reason you didn't hear about it was because we had the only 2 Reform councillors in the country. Okay. And Reform haven't quite decided which way they're voting, so they usually abstain.
I think we'll probably take that as a statement, not a question. Was you going to lead to a question?
The question would be, how do we keep the disaffected Tories from not voting Reform? But on the asides, we're already looking at county. There's 7 seats. They're all Tory. We're talking with our Labour colleagues about who's going for which one, because it's not about standing down. There's a difference between putting up a candidate and spending thousands on a candidate that's not going to win. Okay. There's a big difference.
Okay, well, I'm glad we got you in. I'm glad we found out what was going on there. I just don't think we've got time to if needed to say we'd finish on 2. So, I mean, maybe you can grab people on the way out. So, look, everybody, thank you so much. It was a great panel. I think I'm much more optimistic about future cross-party working, before I walked in, and I'll be much more optimistic when I'm walking out, because we've got Roz Savage on the back benches, we've got Lucy in Cambridge, we've got Vince being an ever old fogey for brilliant coalition politics, and we've got Layla running the Health Select Committee. So I go back to, look, there is a progressive majority in this country. It isn't there just to kind of be, wished into being. We have to work for it. We have to campaign for it locally and nationally. And we have to have a politics at elections, before elections, during elections, and after elections that enables us to mobilise and project that progressive majority, because then we win on terms in which we can change our country. So let's keep working together, talking together, and building that progressive majority, because there's an awful right-wing kind of cabal that want to sneak their way through. And so it is beholden on all of us to work effectively together over the next 4 or 5 years, despite all the terrible things my party sometimes does, the adversarialism, the tribalism. The prize is bigger. And I think what Lucy said about, and Roz said, all the panel have said about the prize is the vision of a better society. Let's keep our eyes on that. Liberal Democrats have got a massive part to play in that. And you will lead the way in terms of a new politics with better policy. So good luck for the rest of the conference. So thank you very much for being here.
We've had to look into the aside.